Manifest Climate offers climate intelligence platform, and here to tell us more about it is Pete Richardson. He's a climate strategist at the company. Now, Pete brings over 15 years of experience advising clients on international law and development with a focus on climate change, energy, and infrastructure. He previously worked in London, Sydney, Jakarta, and Chicago before he came to Toronto. During his career, he's acted on a number of high-profile domestic and international projects, including the development and commercialization of utility-scale renewable energy facilities, innovative technology, and sustainable infrastructure. And during his time in Canada, he also has worked on Indigenous rights projects. All very important skill set to be bringing to the mining and metals industry, Pete. So welcome to the Global Mining Symposium, and really look forward to what you have to show us about the platform here today.
Thank you very much from a wintry Toronto. I'm excited to be here very much. Let me see if I can share my screen and let's see if we can get going here. You can see my screen, Anthony?
It is, yes, it is up. We can see it and the floor is yours.
Perfect. And in some respects, I think this is time to, we'll resume your scheduled programming shortly, but we're going to start just with a little distraction around ESG matters and specifically climate. So firstly, thank you, Anthony and the Northern Miner, for this opportunity. Setting the scene naturally, I want to explain why I'm here and why I'm talking to you. And in many respects, that's probably obvious. Manifest Climate has a particular focus and expertise on climate change. But in the time that I have, I also want to identify the common challenges that we see in the mining sector with respect to climate, and specifically provide 5 takeaways from our work. I appreciate that we have a broad cross-section of the industry here today, and we may be new to some. So in brief, we're a Canadian headquartered, SaaS-focused and data-driven company that's helping companies respond to the question, what is a credible and competitive climate response? First, a quick detour into everyone's favorite topic, the cockpit of an electric car to level set. Our work focuses and deals with the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which in short is a framework to help companies identify, assess, manage, and critically disclose climate risks and opportunities. It's built around 4 pillars that, broadly and metaphorically speaking, cover governance, the rules and procedures for a business that are like the instruction manual for a car, typically found in the glove box. Strategy, which is the forward-looking directional positioning of a business, functioning like a steering wheel. Risk management, which is like the collision avoidance function, such as radar in a modern car. And metrics and targets, which provide all the data, information, and entertainment that you might find in the monitoring systems of your vehicle. Which begs the question, why am I talking about the TCFD, particularly when common to other climate-focused frameworks, it has very little to say on key mining issues like social license, Indigenous engagement, and occupational health and safety. And I'll offer 3 reasons which I anticipate may resonate differently with different sections of the audience. To start with, it's the right thing to do, and I mean that in 2 respects. One is obvious, that having a positive message on climate is table stakes, but less obvious perhaps is that there is an increasing data correlation between good TCFD alignment and financial performance, and we'll come back to that later. Second, for anyone in or exposed to the capital markets, which is likely to be most of our audience, the TCFD will be mandated. The TCFD is the climate framework that regulators are currently focused on. And if I were a betting man, and in some respects I am, because our company is in the business of forward-looking assessments, I would anticipate that the TCFD will be mandated in a significant number of mining relevant jurisdictions within 3 to 5 years. Third, long-term financing for mining is likely to depend on it, in spite of the fact that there are some short-term players in the space. Mining is generally a long-term financing play, which means folks like institutional investors, and those folks really want to see progress on climate specifically, and specifically the use of the TCFD to get the data that they need to make investment decisions. So put differently, if you don't consider and bluntly, frankly, if you don't consider the TCFD, then your financials are essentially incomplete. So let's turn to some of the common challenges that our customers face. We could talk about the delta between our emissions and the ambition needed to address climate change, but you'll have heard that many times. Rather, I want to address 3 issues or objections that we typically hear. The first is to understand how the E, S, and G all fit together and how that dynamic changes over time. And in some respects, you can measure this by the attention paid to those issues from firms like ISS and Glass Lewis, where historically the S and the G of the ESG have dominated the conversation. And there's a good reason for that. The red lines of things like child labor or indigenous engagement are rightly top of mind. But the E has now caught up. And we work with both miners and those that fund the mining community. And it is clear that the E is the critical leg of a three-leg stool. Secondly, we sympathize and we empathize with the objection that there are many frameworks and standards out there. The good news is that there's significant consolidation in the industry, and there's also significantly more support by providers like us and others to help with the navigation issue. The bad news is that there are still lots of frameworks and standards out there, and it's fair to say that there still isn't one ring to rule them all. And the final challenge is one that we often find, both when speaking to miners and financing parties, comes both from the past and from contemporary public reception. These challenges typically fall into two buckets of criticisms. First, I think there's the unjustified, or there is the often coupled but unjustified criticism that miners don't care, or that the industry is an intractably polluting pastime that is not worthy of investment. The first of those criticisms simply isn't true, and the second is a fundamental misunderstanding of the role that mining has to play in the transition to a net zero economy. And then secondly, there is a justified bucket of criticisms, which is borne out in our data and the data of others, that the mining industry is relatively poor at telling its climate story. See, for example, how mining metals fare against other industries on net zero targets, shown here on screen. So let's try to address some of these challenges with 5 key takeaways derived from our work in the industry. Well, the first and most obvious is to improve your storytelling. This does not mean greenwashing or green wishing. Actually, it's quite the opposite. Our data suggests that the industry is doing much more on climate than is publicly made available. And there's a few reasons for this. Like your math problem in class, if you show you're working, as opposed to just a single numbered answer, you often open yourself to criticism, both on the accuracy of the answer and the way you got there. That's okay in a math class when there's a teacher who's there to help. It's less comfortable in the real world when people like activists and others may weaponize your working against you. In this context, then companies become understandably defensive. But the fact is that telling a full story is critical. Cherry picking selected assets or stories is an absolute red flag to investors. And a good climate story often involves the confidence to say, this is where we are and this is where we aspire to be. Number 2, understand your key leverage points. When you think about aspirations, it's critical to understand what is actually going to induce behavior change. The mining industry, like almost every other industry, has a particular focus on metrics and targets, which is understandable, and which is typically to say greenhouse gas emissions. But that's just one part of the story. Metrics and targets are the tip of the iceberg. That's what people see, but in particular, targets only become credible if they are underpinned by the foundational work of good risk management, an effective strategy, and solid governance. Remember the 4 pillars of the TCFD. It's the governance that provides the keystone. Understanding that allows you to identify what really matters, which circles towards things like remuneration and climate-aligned incentives. Those are the things that change behavior. Those are the real leverage points. In its latest status report, the TCFD reveals a big discrepancy between lagging indicators, things like GHG historic emissions, and leading indicators, like the use of scenario analysis on the impact of transition and physical risks. To illustrate the point, in 2020, almost 60% of TCFD preparers disclosed things like GHG emissions, in contrast to just 10 to 14% using scenario analysis. And that's a really important distinction. So in brief, lagging indicators are good, but increasingly they're not enough. Okay, fourthly, it's critical to understand the link between climate impact, whether that's in the form of transitional physical risks and opportunities, and financial impact. So a number of frameworks, including the TCFD, regulators and investors call for the disclosure of climate data in mainstream financial filings. That's why I said earlier, if you're not considering the TCFD, then your financial filings are effectively incomplete. That underscores and reiterates the point that climate risk is financial risk. It also underscores the point that climate opportunities are also financial opportunities. And I'll finish on this point, which is to say that there are lots of publications out there that focus on the top 10 risks for industry X. In our view, it's just as important to identify the corresponding top 10 opportunities. And in this context, I'll just a bonus offer. I said earlier that governance is foundational to an effective climate response. I also said there's an increasingly strong evidence between TCFD alignment and the inoculation from shock and good financial performance. We've actually addressed both of those things in recent white papers, and we'd invite you to look at them. I'd also mention in passing something that's coming up, which is we're looking specifically at the mining sector to shine a light on how investors are actually thinking about climate when they make climate decisions. So look out for that, Anthony.
Excellent, Pete. Thank you. Very timely, very critical to our industry. There is this awakening and awareness in the industry that more needs to be done, but sometimes there is, once you get outside of the big companies that obviously have a lot of resources, once we get down to the mid-tiers and the juniors, there's that willingness, but there's also that desire for some guidance and what really are the best critical steps to take when you have a small team and you have limited resources. So TCFD is a big one. I would say, someone in our group as well, we've been having ESG thinking in the core of our thinking for the last many, many years. And it is nice to see that we are coalescing around some kind of standard here, but maybe give us a little bit more on TCFD. Why is that the one to pay attention to?
Yeah, and I think the message has changed in the last couple of years, because historically you could say, there are a wealth of standards and frameworks out there, and there are still. But the reason why we focus on the TCFD is principally because it's the one that is finding favor with regulators and more or less with investors. I say sort of more or less because investors, frankly, will use any standard or framework to get their hands on data, to get the hands on the data they need. The real reason is because we're headquartered in Canada. There is currently a consultation just closed, in fact, around mandating TCFD. The same is true in the US. A number of other jurisdictions have already aligned to it, and that will have a cascade impact, both upstream and downstream through the value chain.
Great. There's been a lot of talk about as companies get more aligned with ESG, what's that going to mean for their business performance? And there should be a positive correlation there. Specifically with TCFD, is there enough evidence around that yet? Are we seeing companies that make the TCFD standards having better performance?
It's something that we're looking for so intensely, because frankly, that kind of sells itself, right? When we're thinking about this, there is a lot of noise out there, but we are starting to identify signal. So identifying signal in two ways. Firstly, between climate alignment and frankly stock performance. That is a fuzzy signal, but it's getting out there. A much clearer signal is coming from the inoculation of acute risks and TCFD alignment. So taking something out of step a little bit, there is some evidence out there that TCFD alignment, or rather good environmental stewardship per se, is actually a good inoculation to the pandemic, COVID-19, right? Because in many respects, the TCFD is a governance framework masquerading as a climate framework. And so if you build a solid foundation through good climate governance, frankly, what you're building is a good solid foundation to become immune from shock. But clearly, I think we will see an increasingly strong signal as we get more and more into the data here.
Excellent, Pete. Well, that's something to follow. We hope to have you back on a future show to update us on that. And it is so critical. So maybe Laura, let's make sure that I see the download now in Pete's presentation, but if we can maybe extract that or get a link and post that in the chat if we haven't already. So make sure people can get this. This is the download now that we're seeing there, Pete. That is for the white paper?
That is exactly right. Yep. And there's a couple of them on our system, which you'd be welcome to take a look at. As I say, governance, and we've also got that the first foray into proving out that link between TCFD alignment and positive financial performance. The one to look out for is which is coming soon, which is the mining specific. What are investors looking? How do you unpack that black box? That sometimes when we're working with miners, they sort of say, how are investors thinking about this? My ESG rating has gone up, and yet I'm not getting the investment that I need. Like how do you square that circle? It's a black box that we're looking to unpack.
Excellent. Pete, thank you very much for your time on such a crucial piece of the puzzle for the mining industry and being able to bring forward a real positive solution for us. That's great. Thank you, Pete. Have a great rest of the day. It's great
You
to meet
too.
you.
Thanks. You too. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.